And as we're studying the book of Job, we find a man who has experienced so much pain and trouble that he actually says he thinks he would be better off dead. In the first chapter, we learned about Job losing all of his wealth and most of his servants. And to make matters worse, on the same day, a storm came in and killed 10 of his family members. And so here you have, the Bible says, as we read in the text last week, he comes and hears at first that all of his cattle, his livestock are dead. And while that person is still speaking, somebody comes and says he's also lost almost all of his animals. And while he's still speaking, somebody else comes and says, well, a storm came and your family has been killed except for your wife. And then while he's still speaking, it's a fourth piece of bad news. It just rained down all at once on him. And the reason Satan was able to bring this trouble on Job was because Satan alleged to God that if Job suffered, he would curse God to the face. Now, you remember I said last week, and this is important to note, that God was so proud of Job. God was the one who was bragging on Job to Satan when Satan appeared to God. And God was just bragging on Job. He said, have you considered my servant Job? He's the most upright man in the world. And Satan says, well, yeah, but all you've ever done is bless him. All you've ever done is do good things for him. If you take it away from him, he'll curse you to his face. And so in a matter of just seconds, almost everything was taken away from him except his own life and his wife. And his response was, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The next verse in verse 22 says, in all this, Job did not sin, and he did not blame God, and instead, he praised God. He did the opposite of blaming God. He praised God. So, you might say this, after the first chapter, let's say, I like baseball. After the first inning, the score is Job 1, Satan nothing. And Satan has already thrown some of the best part of his batting order up against Job in the first chapter. But here comes the second inning. One day the members of the heavenly court came again to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser Satan came with them. And I want you to notice, almost all of the first 5 verses are exactly the same as the first chapter. The Lord asked Satan, where have you come from? Just as he did in the first chapter. And Satan answered the Lord, I've been patrolling the earth, watching everything that's going on, just like he answered in the first chapter. And the Lord asked Satan again, just like he did in the first chapter, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He's blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. And he has maintained his integrity, even though you urged me to harm him without cause. So up until that verse, everything's exactly the same as what happened in the first chapter. And Satan said, yeah, but you wouldn't let me touch him personally. That's what you said. You wouldn't let me touch him personally. Skin for skin. In other words, let me touch his body. Let me make him sick. Let me make him wish he was dead. And we'll see what was happening then, because Satan said a man will give up everything. A man will give up everything he has to save his life. Reach out and take away his health, and he will surely curse you to your face. And so the Lord said, all right, do with him as you please, but spare his life. So Satan left the Lord's presence, and he struck Job with terrible boils from head to foot. Job scraped his skin with a piece of broken pottery as he sat among the ashes. That does not sound like a very good treatment to me for boils. And so his wife said to him, as he's sitting there scraping boils with broken pottery, are you still trying to maintain your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die? Job replied, you talk like a foolish woman. Should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never anything bad? So in all of this, Job said nothing wrong. Now you're going to see in just a few moments, as time goes on, he's still not going to blame God. He's still not going to curse God. But as he goes through weeks and weeks of agony, he says that he would be better off dead than to deal with all of this suffering in his life. In chapter 3, he says, why wasn't I born dead? Stillborn. Why didn't I die as I came from the womb? Why was I laid on my mother's lap? Why did she nurse me at her breast? Had I died at birth, I would now be at peace. I would be asleep and at rest. And a few verses later in chapter 3, Job said to one of his friends, why give light to those who are in misery and life to those who are bitter? They long for death and it won't come. And I've known some folks like that. They search for death more eagerly than for hidden treasure. They're filled with joy, and when they finally die, they rejoice when they find the grave. Why is life given to those with no future, those God is surrounded with difficulties? I cannot eat for sighing. My groans pour out like water. What I always feared has happened to me. What I dreaded has come true. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest. Only trouble comes. And so as we look at these 10 verses in Job chapter 2, I want to point out 3 very important insights about suffering and pain that God might allow in our lives. And the first is, Satan may be absolutely relentless in his attack. You might think that after you won such enormous victories over Satan as Job did in chapter 1, that you might have won the battle. But he's relentless. That was only the first inning. And you got to give the devil his due. He's a persistent old cuss, if nothing else. Even though Job survived round 1, the devil wasn't through. He gains God's permission for round 2, and he goes on attacking. And he still does with us sometimes too. You say, how did he attack? Sometimes he attacks your health. Sometimes he attacks your health. Satan strikes Job first with painful, pus-filled, itching, inflamed lesions or boils all over his body. He sits in the ashes, which is a sign of mourning, and he tries scraping those sores with broken pottery. And then this is not all of them, but here's Job's medical chart from much of the rest of the book. Chapter 3 talks about he had a loss of appetite and he had depression. Chapter 7 said he had worms in his boils. He doesn't just have boils, he's got worms in his boils. I didn't even think that was possible. He has terrifying nightmares. In chapter 9 it says he has shortness of breath. In chapter 19 he says foul breath. That's the only one of these that doesn't bother me that much. In chapter 19, he says he has a loss of weight. Maybe I need that. No. In chapter 30, it says he has continual pain. He has an inability to rest. He has a high fever. I mean, it goes on and on and on what Satan does to him. And that list doesn't even mention the enormous social scorn and pride, or loss of pride, that Job went through. He was ostracized from society. He lost his position. He lost his prominence. He lost his place in society. You might say Job became the Rodney Dangerfield of Uz. He got no respect. So listen to me very carefully. We know from this passage Satan can sometimes attack our health. It could be our physical health, it could be our mental or emotional health. It certainly is our spiritual health. Certainly is our spiritual health. And I'm not saying that every sickness is a direct attack from Satan. Certainly that's crazy. But we can learn that when permitted, Satan will try to attack your health. In fact, if I were to say who's the greatest New Testament Christian of all, I think we would probably settle on a consensus vote on the Apostle Paul. Turned from Saul of Tarsus into Paul. Established hundreds of churches. Wrote over half of the New Testament. And yet even he said, even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh. How was he given it? Where did it come from? A messenger from Satan to torment me from becoming proud. So whatever Paul's thorn in the flesh was, it came from Satan who was attacking his health. In Acts chapter 10, when the Apostle Peter was telling Cornelius about the many wonderful acts of Jesus, he said, you know that God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, and Jesus went around doing good and healing. Jesus went around doing good and healing all who were oppressed. Now, where was their sickness coming from? By the devil. And so as you read through the Gospels, you know that what Peter was telling him was true because you read gospel account after gospel account of Jesus healing people with physical illnesses. So just remember, Satan wants to make you miserable. He may do it by attacking your physical health or your emotional health. He may make you feel shamed, outside, lost, a loser. Or your mental health, depression or anxiety at the top of that list. Or your spiritual health. He may want to attack your health. He may also want to attack your family. That's what he did here with Job. He attacked his family, his children first, and then he attacked the relationship with his wife. You know, when a man is down, isn't it good to know that he's got a wife he can really count on for love and support, a wife who will really hang in there with him no matter what? And so Mrs. Job says to him, why don't you just cuss God and die? Cuss, that's the southern word for the original language. Can you feel the love tonight? Why don't you just cuss God and die? That's why Satan didn't kill Job's wife along with his kids, is because she was helping him. She wants Job to toss in the towel for life insurance. Satan's a crafty old dog. He will attack you by attacking the ones you love. He will attack you by attacking the ones who are close to you. In this instance, he uses Job's wife. Now, before we get too critical, and man, Job's wife's been beat up badly through the years, and I just cynically did it a little bit myself. We got to remember Mrs. Job was suffering greatly as well. She had just lost 10 children. She was watching her mate suffer physically. Most of us are wired in a way that we would rather hurt than watch the person we love the most hurting. But the main thing to learn here is that Satan wants to drive a wedge through every family. He may use your spouse, he may use your children, he may use your mom and dad or your grandparents. He wants to drive a wedge in every family. And so Job replied to her saying, why don't you just curse God and die, by saying, you talk like a foolish woman. Now I want you to notice an important difference here. He didn't say you're a foolish woman. Never a good thing for a husband to say. Never. He said, you're talking like a foolish woman. You sound like, he didn't call his wife a fool, He said she was talking like a foolish woman because she was talking foolishly about God. And so he said, a rhetorical question, should we accept only good things from the hand of God and never bad? Well, that's a good question for all of us to ask ourselves, is it not? Is that what we want to be? We want to be just the kids that always get showered with blessings and gifts and wonderful things and never anything that's not. You know what those kids are called? Spoiled brats. And in all this, Job said nothing wrong. Don't let Satan attack you through those who love you. Insight number one, Satan is relentless. He is not ever going to give up on this side of eternity. But insight number two is, and this is important for every one of us in application in our lives, God's best servants may sometimes feel like giving up. Now, a moment ago we read Job chapter 3 in the New Living Translation, and I just want to read it in the Message, a couple of verses in the Message. Why does God bother giving light to the miserable? Why bother keeping bitter people alive? Those who want in the worst day to die and can't. Who can't imagine anything better than death. Yeah, why? Why? You know, when I think about that verse, I'm reminded that whenever I study the book of Job, I sometimes forget an often overlooked fact. And that is, Job never read the first two chapters of Job. Job never learned the reason for his suffering and pain. We're informed about the battle that was going on in heaven, but Job is never informed. And he's going to ask a bunch of questions in the next few weeks as we go through the series. You'll see he's going to ask a bunch of questions. God never answers them. God never told Job the reason for his agony. That doesn't stop his friends. We'll start in on his friends next week from offering their opinions on why this is happening to him. And for 35 chapters, his friends offer a lot of opinions on why this is happening to Job. But God never explains a reason. He was just experiencing the depth of his pain, bemoaning the fact that sometimes life becomes so painful that you're just ready to go to the next world. That's why suicide happens. You say, was Job suicidal? No, I don't believe he was. There's nothing in the book that says that he actually did that. But even God's best servants sometimes feel like giving up, including Job, who never blamed God, but still felt like giving up. You know some of other God's best servants who felt the same way? How about Elijah? Elijah, my favorite scene in the Old Testament, I've said many times, is when Elijah defeats 800 false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. 800 to 1 odds. And you would think he's on top of the world. And one little old woman, Jezebel, says, I'm going to kill you as soon as I see you. And he takes off running into the desert away from one woman. Now that I think about it, I can kind of understand that. But nevertheless, when he gets out there, he hides under a juniper tree and he says, I have zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you. And Lord, I have had enough. Please just let me die under this juniper tree. Elijah. All right, so we got Job felt that way. Elijah felt that way. How about Jeremiah? Jeremiah, one of the great prophets of God who prophesied in a very, very hard time, said, I cursed the day I was born. May no one celebrate the day of my birth. He said, why was I ever born? My entire life has been filled with trouble and sorrow and shame. Even God's most faithful servants have felt this way at some time or another and have expressed it, and it's been recorded for us in the Bible. And there's a reason why it's been recorded for us in the Bible, and I think it's because the Spirit of God knew that sometimes many of us might feel that way too. Job, Elijah, Jeremiah. You say, well, Randy, have you ever felt that way? No, not more than 2 or 3 times a day anyway. Many people have felt this way. It's okay to look at suffering and troubled times in life and then contemplate heaven and say, I'd be better off dead. That doesn't mean it's true that we should contemplate actually ending our lives or quitting on God. Job didn't. Elijah didn't. Jeremiah didn't. I'm not going to. You shouldn't either. But even some of God's greatest servants have felt that way. Now, unless you've been hiding in a cave for the last half century, you've probably seen the movie at some time or another, It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. It's interesting, when Frank Capra first released that movie, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. When he first released the movie in 1946, it was a box office flop. Nobody went to see it. It was almost immediately removed from the theaters. And then since then, it's become this classic that you can't get away from on Christmas, actually. And as you know, the movie centers around the character of George Bailey. Life has become so painful for George Bailey that he runs away from his family on Christmas Eve. And he sits in a bar over a drink, and he prays. He sits in a bar over a drink, and he prays. Father, I'm not a praying man, but if you're up there and you can hear me, show me the way. I'm at the end of my rope. Show me a way, oh God. And after his prayer, the guy who's sitting next to him, who's the husband of his daughter's school teacher, punches him for drunkenly insulting his wife on the phone. Outside, George reaches up and rubs his bloodied lip and says, that's what I get for praying. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever prayed, nothing immediately got better, and you thought, that's what I get for praying? You're at the bottom of the barrel and you think things can't possibly get worse, and then the bottom of the barrel falls out. And you find out, oh yeah, things can get a whole lot worse. And clutching his life insurance policy, he decides it'd be better off for everybody if he were dead. So we see him standing in the middle of the bridge, gazing down into the icy waters and the snow. He's on the verge of giving up and committing suicide. And just at that moment, God answers his prayer. And he sends his bumbling, stumbling guardian angel, Clarence, down to try to help him out. And Clarence falls into the river, and George jumps in and rescues him. But he doesn't recognize that as being the answer to prayer. Most of the time we don't. So Clarence arranges for George to see what life would be like if he had never been born, which is sort of the heart of the movie. And one of the things that he does on their course of that journey is he takes him to a cemetery where he sees his brother Harry Bailey's cemetery plot, that he died when he was 8 years old. And George says, no, that can't possibly be true. Harry's a hero. He flew in the war. He saved all those people on the transport. Clarence says, every man on that transport died. Because Harry wasn't there to save them, because you weren't there to save Harry when he was drowning. And then Clarence gives George the most powerful line in the movie. He says, strange, isn't it? Each man's life touches so many other lives. When he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he? Not long after that, we see George on his knees praying again, saying, help me, Clarence, get me back. I don't care what happens to me. I want to live again. I want to live. Dear God, please let me live again. And I'm not going to tell the rest of the story in case you haven't seen it. and give away all the lines. I also don't want to tell the rest of the story because I might start crying, and that would be a sad and pathetic thing. But is to say this: there are people now who think my life isn't very wonderful, just like George Bailey did. There are people every day who contemplate giving up on their life, like George Bailey was contemplating, and like Job was contemplating, and like Elijah was contemplating, and like Jeremiah were contemplating. God says, no, 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 I care about you. I notice when even a little sparrow falls to the earth and is suffering, how much more I care for you. The third important spiritual insight that I get out of these verses is you can do it. You can maintain your spiritual integrity during Satan's attacks. Job's wife said to him, "Are you still trying to maintain your integrity?" You said, even though the devil is persistent in his attacks, and even though you go through periods of deep discouragement, maybe even depression, you need to know you can maintain your integrity. You say, well, what does that word mean there, integrity? It's a word that gets kind of covered up in our society too much today. So I went to the dictionary, and I learned something I didn't know. According to dictionary.com, integrity is the quality or condition of being whole and undivided. In fact, it's from the Latin word integritas, which comes from another word, integer. Now, you know what an integer is, don't you? Let's start with that word integer. In math, an integer is a whole number. It's a number that isn't fractional. So, for instance, 5 is an integer, but 5 3/4 is not an integer. To maintain your integrity means your heart and your mind are not divided. They are whole. The word integrity here means you are still put together, whole and complete. You don't have a divided heart. You don't have a divided mind. You are still whole before God. Are you still maintaining your integrity, your wholeness before God? Why don't you just curse God and die? The Bible says, no, you don't have to do that. At the very time God had forsaken him, God was actually giving Job very personal, almost microscopic attention. Job didn't know it for sure, but he was. When you think about it, in one sense, God was putting his entire reputation in the heavens on how Job would respond to this. So remember, both in chapter 1 and chapter 2, there were an audience of angels around. Satan had declared before hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe millions, we don't know, of heavenly creatures that Job would break down and curse God when he suffered enough. And God, who is omniscient, said, no, he won't. I know he won't. Like us, when Job was suffering, he couldn't fully understand all the details of God's plan. He just had to trust that God had a plan. Did you hear me? And in the last chapter of the book, Job shows his trust in that. He says to God, I know that you can do anything and no one can stop you. After all he'd been through, I know you can do anything and no one can stop you. Sometimes you simply have to believe God even when you don't have any visible evidence that things are the way you know they should be. I think one of the best television shows ever produced, I've said this many times, is the Andy Griffith Show. And I've seen every episode multiple times. Now I'm introducing my 12-year-old grandson to it. About 2 years ago, Taylor comes and stays with us about 1 week and a month, and we found out a couple of years ago he had never seen the Andy Griffith Show. Well, that's a sin and abomination before the Lord. And so we introduced him to the Andy Griffith Show. And so now, even at age 12, when he comes to our house, he says, I want to eat my grilled cheese, or I want to eat my dinner or my lunch with Chief and Mimi watching the Andy Griffith Show. So we'll eat in front of the TV. I know some of you hate that. Well, deal with it. And we watch Andy Griffith shows. And not too long ago, the show came up called Mr. McBeevy. I don't know how many of you remember that show. And in that particular episode, Opie claims that he has met a friend out in the woods named Mr. McBeevy. And he describes to Andy and Aunt Bee and Barney and everybody else what sounds like an alien. He claims Mr. McBeevy came down from a tree wearing a big shiny hat, and he jingled when he walked, and he could make smoke come out of his ears. And so Andy says, okay, and they go out in the woods looking for Mr. McBeevy, and there's no sign of Mr. McBeevy. And Andy and Barney are certain that he's making all this up. One day, Opie brings in a hatchet, and he says, Mr. McBeevy gave me this. Another day, he brought in a quarter and said Mr. McBeevy gave him a quarter. Can you imagine the difference between 1964 and 2022? A quarter. A kid wouldn't even talk to somebody for a quarter. But by now, Andy is concerned Opie's making all this up, and he's stealing items from places. And he finally gets so frustrated that he sits Opie down and tells him he's got to admit that he's been lying and that he's been making the whole story up about Mr. McBeevy, and that if he'll just admit it, things will go much better for him. Boy, my daddy had that conversation with me. Boy, I've had that conversation with my boys, haven't you? And Opie won't admit it. And instead, he looks at his dad and says, but he's real, Pa. He's real. Don't you believe me? And Andy thinks for a moment before he answers. And he says, yes, son, I believe you. But then he goes back to the police station and he tells Barney 5 what had happened. And Barney goes unglued and says, come on, Andy, you don't believe in Mr. McBeevy, do you? And in the best line of the show, Andy says, no, Barn, I don't believe in Mr. McBeevy, but I do believe in Opie. And just a short time later, Andy walks out in the woods, and his frustration, he just shouts out in the air, Mr. McBeevy, Mr. McBeevy! And suddenly, crawling down out of the tree is a linesman, a forester with a full belt of tools, wearing a silver hat. And Andy grabs his hand and says, Mr. McBeevy, you're real. I can't tell you how happy I am to meet you. You have to do the same thing. You may be in the midst of suffering and you can't see any evidence of God's hand, and that's when you still have to trust His plan. You have to say, Satan, I don't believe in you, but I do believe in God. Job had to say that time after time after time. And if you do that, you too can maintain your spiritual integrity during Satan's attacks. You see, when we're hurting, we often put our eyes on our desperate circumstances. And we beg God to change our circumstances. And if you're looking all the time at your circumstances, you're focused on the wrong thing. You should be looking for God. See what God is doing. Even though you may not see His face, you can always, always trust His grace in your life. And even though Job was suffering tremendously and in deep despondency, he never gave up on God. The book says that over and over and over again. He never blamed God. Even though he asked some questions that would make us think he wanted to die, he never gave up. He never sinned against God by blaming God. He never, ever did what Mrs. Job asked him to do, curse God and die. Instead, by faith, and this had to be by faith, it couldn't be by anything else, by faith, he looked 2,000 years into the future and he saw a Redeemer. Now remember, I told you in lesson 1, we're pretty certain this was the first book written in the Bible. He didn't know about Abraham. He didn't know about God's chosen people. But somehow he was able to look into the future and say, as for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and he will stand upon the earth at last. And after my body has decayed, yet in my body, I will see God. One true story, and then I close. I don't know how many of you have ever been here. This is the Holocaust Museum dedicated to millions of Jews who died in World War II. It's in Washington, D.C. How many of you have been there? Well, I have too, and it was a difficult, painstaking visit. Almost everything in there is horrible. To hear the story of the concentration camps and the ghettos and the ovens. But in the midst of all the dark tales of suffering, there are also some unbelievable stories of God transforming horror into hope. I've told you so many of them from the work of Corrie ten Boom through the years. But it's like you find so many stories that are like finding a diamond in a garbage heap. In one of the German concentration camps, there was a young lady named Rachel. She had undergone much torture from the guards. When she worked outside, they made her work in winter snow and ice with just one little thin dress on. She had nearly died several times from malnutrition. And so, kind of like Job in the first chapter. Job liked stuff. And then one day, suddenly, without any announcement, the guards were all gone. Nobody explained what was happening. The next day, some American soldiers showed up, told them to pack what little things they had, and they would be going with them. They had smiles on their faces. One of the American soldiers held the door open for her, and she just stopped before she got to the door. And she started breaking down and crying. And he said, "Ma'am, what's wrong with you?" And she said, "Nobody has ever done anything that nice for me." Holding a door open for you in a concentration camp is the nicest thing anybody's ever done for you. And Rachel left and got on the transport vehicle with everybody else. And then later found out that American soldier's name and contacted him. And they got together and they began dating and they married. And he held doors open for her for the rest of her life. That's what God can do. He can open doors when nobody else thinks it's possible. He can take the most terrible situation imaginable and make something utterly beautiful out of it. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns from heaven above with wisdom, power, and love. Our God is an awesome God. Job's going to find that out. Job's going to find out that whenever you go through tough times, you can either look for the junk or you can look for the joy. Little teaser, a little trailer like you get in a movie to come. The last verse of the book says, "So the Lord blessed Job in the second half of his life even more than in the beginning, for now he had 7,000 sheep and 6,000 camels and 1,000 teams of oxen and 1,000 female donkeys." Oh, we're going to get there. But we've got some more bad stuff to go through first in order to learn a lot about how God helps us deal when the bubble bursts.